Hey, good afternoon. I am going to go ahead and turn my camera on so that you can actually see me as if we were in an in-person meeting. And unfortunately, I can't see all of our attendees. But even though I can't see you, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. We are recording this meeting, so for those who couldn't make it, there will be an option to watch this presentation after the fact, and of course we'll share the materials from today's meeting. I'm going to go ahead and introduce myself before we get started. I'm Mira Shanker, and I work at Waterfront Toronto in the Communications and Public Engagement Group. I work on the Portland's Flood Protection Project and also the Lakeshore Boulevard East project. Before we get started, I also want to explain to everyone that your microphones and cameras are not enabled. So the way to participate in today's meeting is to use the chat. And we'll go through that in a few moments in a little bit more detail for those who don't know where that function is in Microsoft Teams. Before moving into an overview of the agenda, I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that the land that we'll be talking about today is on the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, and Toronto has historically been a gathering place for many Indigenous people, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and today is home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. So we're joined today by members of our project team from Waterfront Toronto and the City of Toronto, and they're here to answer your questions about those two projects I mentioned earlier, Portland's Flood Protection and Lakeshore Boulevard East. I'd like to quickly introduce them and let you know who all is here with us today, since again, we can't see everyone because we're not in the room together, unfortunately. So I'd like to introduce our Chief Project Officer at Waterfront Toronto, David Stern, who's here with us today. From Colliers, working with us at Waterfront Toronto as part of our project team on these projects, is John McKee. From Dillon Consulting, working with us on the Lakeshore Boulevard East project, Don McKinnon. From Transportation Services with the City of Toronto, we have Nathan Chan joining us. From the City of Toronto's Waterfront Secretariat, we have Christian Giles joining us, and you can see a couple of those faces popping up there. There are also lots of other members of our broader team at Waterfront Toronto, City of Toronto. We have some folks from Metrolinx joining us today. And during the Q&A, whoever is best positioned to answer your questions, we'll be able to call them up. As long as I know that they're here, we'll call the best person up to answer that question during the Q&A later today. So speaking of the Q&A, let's review the agenda for today. For today's meeting. If Kate, you could go ahead and advance these slides since I'm powerless. We'll come back to this next slide on housekeeping in a moment. Just quickly review what it is that we're talking about here today. We're going to give a quick update on our Portland's Flood Protection Project. We're several years into this very exciting revitalization, and we'll show some images and ask David to walk us through the latest exciting construction updates. We'll then move into a project overview, and I'll ask Don to come up and give, for those of you who are not familiar with the Lakeshore Boulevard East project, give some overview on what that work is, as well as an overview of how we plan to move forward with the construction when that starts in the fall of this year. And then we'll give you a bit of an overview of some of the feedback we've received already on this construction, and we'll talk a little bit about the next steps as we move into, as I said, construction in the fall. So now let's go back one slide and just give you a quick sense of how this is all going to work since we are online still. So as I said, this meeting is being recorded and is going to be posted to YouTube. As I said, only the presenters are visible in the recorded version. So those of us who've turned our cameras on will be visible. You can type your questions into the chat at any point during the meeting. The Q&A will start once the presentation is over, but feel free to post your comments and questions in the chat anytime, and our staff, as you can see, Michaela is already answering questions there. We'll address any issues you might be having if they're technical issues, if you're having some trouble hearing the meeting. You can also put in your questions as the presentation progresses. As the questions or comments come to you, feel free to get those into the chat, and then we will move into answering your questions during the Q&A at the end of the presentation. So With that said, let's get started. Let's advance through to our first item on the agenda, which is Portland's flood protection. And we'll ask David to take us from here.
Thanks, Mira. Good afternoon, everyone. You can see here the overhead shot of the eastern waterfront. There are many transformational projects that are being undertaken in this area. Currently and over the next few years, Portland's flood protection is certainly one of the larger projects and one we're very proud of, but other projects are underway now as well. The Coxwell Bypass and the Ashbridges Bay outfall projects by Toronto Water, very large infrastructure projects underway. The City of Toronto just recently completed the Gardner rehab, and in a couple of years we'll be looking at the Gardner hybrid relocation pursuant to the EA that was completed a couple of years ago. And Metrolinx are getting ready to kick off a number of projects, including the expansion of GO Rail and the Ontario line, amongst other projects. So these are all building on projects that are continuing across the eastern waterfront, and will continue with the ultimate development of Villiers Island, East Harbor, and the balance of the Portlands over the coming decades, actually. With respect to the work that we're doing, Portland's flood protection, we can go to the next slide, but we'll be adding about the equivalent of 25 football fields of green space to the area. We're going to zoom in on that area in a minute, but if we can go to the next slide, Michaela or Kate. Oh, there it is. Thank you. So you can see the area of the project for the Portland's flood protection work. That work is underway, as Mira mentioned, and this is what it looked like from above several years ago. Before we started, we're almost just over halfway through, and are on schedule to complete the project in March of 2024. So next slide, and we'll show you what it'll look like when we're complete. So you can see we're doing a very large project here, but it is not all of the work that needs to be done. There are other parks that need to be completed once we've completed the river and the 3 parks, 3 roads and bridges that we're undertaking, and then there will be development that will happen on Villiers Island and the south of river precincts, over the next, as I say, coming decades. You see the new mouth of the Don, Canoe Cove at the mouth of the Don, where we've renaturalized, pursuant to the Don Mouth EA, New Cherry Street in its new alignment, and a rebuilt Commissioners and Don Roadway, which are being built to ultimately accommodate LRT transit, but are also being built to accommodate the future development in terms of traffic, cyclists, pedestrians, and services. Next slide. So an update of where we are today. Go to the next slide. You can see we're working across the entire site, from the north in the SDMA, or the Sediment and Debris Management Area, where work is just beginning. In the yellow areas, excavation is complete in about 75% of the river, with just one area left to be excavated. We call the elbow. It's just south of Commissioner Street, at the intersection of these 3 yellow lines. And work is actually beginning from a soils perspective on the parklands. You can see in orange, and as well utilities are being installed in Commissioner Street, on New Cherry Street and the Don Roadway. So a lot of work happening all across the site, and we're going to show some evidence of that with some video and photos coming up next. This is just a little animation of the timeline for excavation, starting in 2020. You can see that where we are through June of this year, all areas complete, with the exception of the elbow, which we will have completed in the next a month or 2. Next slide. So this is a video. Kate will hit the start. You can see the river alignment here through the Central River Valley. It is the sinuous, oh, we've lost the presentation. At least I have. And coming back. Here we go. So you can see the river, the base of the river, the area that the river will follow is that S curve. That's actually the finished bottom of the river. You can see that we've started excavating at the mouth of the river. So that Polson Slip, we've removed the west end or east end of the Polson Slip, and that's where we will connect the new river to as the mouth. It's taking its time. There we go. That work's happening. On the left is the Atlas crane that is being fixed to a degree and will remain in the final park. It's a heritage structure. Work on the left here is Promontory Park. You can see that we've started working on dock walls. This is the dock wall improvements that need to happen to support what is happening on the promontory. So Promontory Park is this entire area that you see. This is the Cherry Street Lakeville project that we completed just over a year and a bit ago. So that ultimately will become part of Promontory Park North. That is a future piece of work, not part of what we're doing as part of the Portland's flood protection. You've seen, I think everyone's seen the bridges. This is the Cherry Street LRT bridge. Either later this year or in next spring, its partner will join it, the vehicular bridge for Cherry Street, prior to Cherry Street opening up next August or September. Down the Keating Channel, we'll be doing a little bit of work. We're working with the City, Ports Toronto, and TRCA here to undertake dredging, which is necessary to ensure that we achieve full flood protection. The Keating Channel will be part of the flood conveyance system when we're complete in 2024. You can see to the right, fair amount of excavation. We'll see that again as we turn up the river. That is the ice management area. To the left here is the sediment and debris management area. Work is started there to clear the site and make it ready for construction to commence in the next month or so. And then as we turn up the river, you'll see that we've started the excavation of the ice management area just north of Villiers Street, or just south of Villiers Street, pardon me, is complete, and we've started to install the environmental barriers that we need there. In front of us here is the west half of the Commissioner Street Bridge. The east half of this bridge will arrive in late August, early September, depending on the St. Lawrence Seaway. And then here's the elbow excavation underway. And again, back into, we'll see shortly, the Central River Valley with the meandering river valley base and the wetlands on either side, and then parks north and south of the wetlands. And doing this as a walk takes much, much longer. So I think that's just about it with the shot of the skyline always as the last part of what we see here across to downtown. So very large site, work happening all across it, as you can see, by our construction manager, Ella Stawn, and our consultants, MVVA, Intuitive, and WSP, working very hard to keep the project on time and on budget. Let's move to the next slide. So some of the work that's happened recently, we have relocated the Fire Hall 30. This is a heritage structure built in the 1920s. It had to move, not very far, but it had to move because of the new elevation of Commissioner Street, and we have widened Commissioner Street to accommodate LRT. And unfortunately, this building was in that widening. So we have relocated it. It will be part of the future park. It'll be one of the park elements. We're starting by putting public washrooms in it, but ultimately the city will be deploying this building for other uses in the park. And by the way, we have on our website, there are some blog posts and other interesting things on some of this work, how it's undertaken and what it takes to do the work. You can see here, we've started work on structures and finishes in the river. So this is the root wad installation. We are essentially using these trees to create structures for the riverbank to prevent the riverbank from or the river from washing away in the event of a flood. We need to ensure that all the work that we've done, is retained in the event that that flood happens. So these are crib walls that are being constructed, and this is one of the ways that we ensure that the river doesn't meander any further than we've designed it to. There are other ways as well. We'll be putting in armor, stoning, and some other features that will protect the banks of the river from erosion in the event of a flood. Next. I mentioned that we had started excavation at the river mouth. So this is the end of the Polson Slip. We've excavated to essentially remove the soil beneath the Cherry Street South Bridge so that when that bridge arrives in October, November, we're able to install the bridge and not have to excavate below that. Just to the east of that bridge is our diaphragm wall, or what we call the west plug. That plug is there to ensure that the excavation of the river stays dry while we complete all of the work that we're doing in there from a structural and planting perspective. And then ultimately in 2023, we will open this plug and remove this plug to allow the river to flow into, or actually to allow the harbor to flow into the river. And then following that, we would be opening the north plug to allow the Don River to actually make its full journey through the Portlands into the inner harbor. Next. Mentioned the Commissioner Street Bridge. So the West Bridge arrived in May. The east half of this bridge, which will look just like this, will arrive in the next month or so. And then both bridges will be connected to each other and put on their final foundations, ultimately to allow for the reopening of Commissioner Street sometime next summer in June or July.
Thanks, David.
And I think that's it for me. Yeah.
That is it for you. Obviously, there's a huge site, as David said, and there's a lot going on. We regularly share all kinds of information about this. And if there's anything specific that you didn't see there was already a comment about one area of interest. Feel free to put those comments in the chat, or you can always reach out to us after the fact. Now I'm going to ask Don to take us through these next few sections, focusing on the Lakeshore Boulevard East project.
Great, thanks, Myra. Next slide, please. So I'm going to provide an overview of the project and explain where these projects are coming from and how they relate. So essentially what we're doing is bringing together two projects that overlap in the same space. The overlap primarily being Lakeshore Bridge and Lakeshore Boulevard extending over the river and to the east. The two projects that are being brought together is the Portlands Flood Protection Project, specifically the improvements that are required over the Don River with the Lakeshore Boulevard Bridge, and secondly, works associated with the Gardner East project that includes the rehabilitation of Lakeshore Boulevard. And so we see the two projects overlapping in the space shown on this slide. Next slide. So the reasons why these two projects are being brought together to be implemented over the same timeline are presented in this slide. A number of reasons, first of which is lower cost in bringing these construction projects together as opposed to constructing them in separate time spans. Second, combining the two projects will result in a shorter construction period, and as a result, about 2 years less of traffic disruption associated with the construction project. Thirdly, it'll be safer, primarily to remove the overhead ramps, to get those out of the way so that the Lakeshore Bridge over the Don River can be reconstructed in a safer manner. And then finally, while bringing the projects together, will allow for the advancement of the improvements along Lakeshore Boulevard, including new green space as well as bike lanes 4 years earlier had the projects been constructed separately. So next slide, please. So again, the project area that's covered by this particular construction activity that's to be started in the fall includes essentially Lakeshore Boulevard, the Logan ramps, and the Lakeshore Bridge that extends roughly from the DVP ramps in the west and then extending over to Carla Avenue in the east. So the works do not include any modifications to the DVP ramps. Those are not being affected by this project. The focus is on the Logan ramps that extend from the DVP down to Lakeshore, and then everything that lies underneath the Logan ramps, including the bridge and Lakeshore Boulevard East. Next slide, please. So again, the focus here, or at least initially, is to remove the overhead Logan ramps that are highlighted in yellow, again, extend from the DVP ramp connections in the west and over to where they touch down at Lakeshore just before Logan. Next slide. So the works include essentially two pieces. The first is the bridge, so the Lakeshore Boulevard Bridge that sits on top of or over the Don River. And there's essentially sort of two main components to the works. One is what we refer to as a lengthening of the bridge, so lengthening it in an east-west direction, and that's to allow the widening of the Don River mouth to facilitate the river flows associated with the Portland's flood protection project. So next slide. And the second is what we refer to as a widening of the bridge. So essentially in a north-south direction. So making the bridge wider to accommodate the pedestrian cycling facilities as well as roadway lanes that are shown in this cross section. And this is a western looking view of the new cross section that will be developed. That includes starting on the south side, a pedestrian sidewalk, 3 eastbound travel lanes and a left turn lane to provide access onto the Don roadway, and then 3 westbound road lanes, then a cycle pathway, and then a sidewalk. Next slide. And then further to the east of the Don River crossing, the improvements to the Lakeshore Boulevard will continue to be made. Again, a western-looking cross-section that shows the new pedestrian facilities, 3 lanes of through traffic in both directions, a center median that could accommodate the possibility for the relocation of the Harbor lead line, as well as new green space and a separated bike path on the north side, as well as a pedestrian pathway to the north of that as well. Next slide. So I have a number of images that show existing conditions and then to contrast those against the future proposed conditions. So this first image, back up, sorry. This first image is showing a western view at Carla, so looking west along the north side of Lakeshore Boulevard. So next slide. So this drawing is showing the proposed improvements at Carla and the Lakeshore Boulevard intersection. So it clearly shows the new pedestrian and cycling markings that is intended to provide a safer environment for the crossing of the streets, including Lakeshore Boulevard, as well as illustrating how the new pathways will come into connection with this intersection, as well as the new plantings associated with the roadway improvements. Next slide. And then again, looking west at Booth. So again, we'll see existing conditions. I think the key point with this particular photo is that there exists at this time no north-south crossing of Lakeshore Boulevard. under the existing condition. So next slide. So with the improvements, there will be a pedestrian as well as cycle crossing of Lakeshore Boulevard on the west side of the Booth intersection. And then again, demonstrating how the new pedestrian and cycle facility pathways will connect in with the crossing, as well as the new proposed green space on both sides of the roadway. And this will be a signalized intersection. And then again, looking west on the north side of Lakeshore, we see the existing overhead Logan ramps on the left of the image, sort of generally a highway character of Lakeshore Boulevard. And the next slide. And here's the improvements of the cycle path and then the pedestrian walkway, as well as the generous new plantings, including new trees, creating greater amount of shade during the summertime, creating a new microclimate along the north side of Lakeshore Boulevard. Next slide. And again, looking west towards getting closer towards the Dawn roadway, again, the overhead Logan ramps certainly foremost in the image. Some plantings on the north side of the boulevard associated with the Martin Goodman Trail. Next slide. And then again, from the driver's perspective, looking west, so 3 lanes of road traffic, and then the planted area on the north side of the boulevard. Next slide. And then now looking east at Dawn roadway with existing multi-use path very close to the roadway and the overhead Logan ramps. Next slide. And then here we see the pathway looking east, so the cycle path just to the immediate of the north of the road lanes, and then further north of that, separated by a planting area, is the pedestrian walkway. And next slide. And then looking at the Dawn roadway intersection, so again, a western facing view, noting no pedestrian crossing on the west side of the intersection. Certainly narrow space as well for pedestrians as well as cyclists in this existing condition. Next slide. And here we have an overview, plan view of the new bridge, so the wider, longer bridge, as well as the new intersection at Dawn roadway that shows pedestrian crossings possible on all legs of the intersection, and then the tie-ins of the cycle path to go along the north side of Lakeshore, as well as down to the south of Lakeshore along Dawn roadway. Next slide. So now that I've showed you what the future is going to look like, the next set of slides are going to talk about the construction of the project and the timing of that construction and the various traffic mitigation measures that will be put in place to minimize travel disruption during the construction period. So next slide, please. So first, starting off with the schedule for the project. So as of September 1, it's currently proposed that the Logan ramps will be closed, so they will no longer be accessible. So again, those are the ramps highlighted in the yellow on the image below, tying in Lakeshore over to the Gardner on the left side of the image. Then the removal of the ramps, which is to be focused during the weekend period, is to be initiated in September and extend into October. So roughly about a month to 2 months to remove those ramps. And then once the ramps are out of the way, works or the reconstruction of Lakeshore Bridge can commence as of October, which is expected to extend out to January of 2024. And then associated with that and soon following the reconstruction of the ramps will be the start of the reconstruction of Lakeshore Boulevard from the bridge over to Carla Avenue. And that's to extend out to December 2024. So a little over a 3-year construction period for this project. Next slide. So appreciating that there are many challenges in this area that are associated with the construction of this project. First and foremost, I think that everybody is likely aware that this is a very high traffic area for cars, trucks, cyclists, pedestrians, and in all directions. And it certainly makes it challenging to manage the movement of people through this corridor. As well, with the removal of the Logan ramps, we need to appreciate that that will put more traffic at the Jarvis Lakeshore Boulevard intersection, because that becomes one of the main access points to come off the Gardiner as well as access the Gardiner with removal of the Logan ramps, as well as with the removal of the overhead ramps that will put more traffic through the Dawn Roadway and Lakeshore Boulevard, which again is a focus of the construction area. As well, with the road closures, there will be a requirement of lane diversions or lane reductions, and which also mean the need to develop and manage detours for vehicles as well as for pedestrians and cyclists through this period. So the next set of slides are going to focus on what these mitigation measures are. So in developing the mitigations and the traffic management plan for the construction period, certainly there was a lot of effort put into this that included an extensive traffic or transportation modeling exercise that looked at quite a large area. So on this image, we see effectively the study area for the modeling, or we call the forecasting of how traffic is expected to respond to the various changes in the corridor. So extending up to Bloor, Jameson in the west, Vic Park in the east, and then down to Lakeshore or the lake in the south. One of the key findings coming out of the modeling work that was done is an indication that certainly drivers and vehicles will continue to choose the Lakeshore corridor as the main means for east-west travel through the corridor. And as a result of that, the necessity is to be able to manage that demand through this corridor throughout the construction period. Next slide. So in developing the traffic management plan, the plan was developed with input from a number of stakeholders and interests, including various city departments, residents, business owners in the area, as well as road and trail users. And it's important as well to appreciate that in developing a management plan, we're really attempting to forecast and understand how traffic will react to the various changes to the road network during construction. So it's considered an adaptive plan in the sense that the city and Waterfront Toronto will be monitoring traffic throughout the construction period, and it may be necessary to make adjustments to that plan depending on actual movement of traffic, and if issues are determined or identified in certain parts of the area, then to explore what measures or what additional mitigations could be put in place to deal with it. So it's very much an ongoing effort to manage traffic throughout the construction period. It's not a static plan. It's very much an adaptive plan that potentially could change throughout the construction period. Earlier I outlined some of the challenges. So to focus on the right side here of this slide, some of the mitigations that are being proposed. First, the idea of strategic staging in developing the plan, the traffic management plan, coordination with other projects, other city projects occurring in this timeline was an important part of this plan, so that key roadways that are proposed for detours are not going to be impacted by other projects that could also be occurring on those roadways. So again, recognizing all the other things that are happening in the study area, and to ensure that there's coordination of other projects that may be happening to not further impact the movement of people through the area. As I indicated earlier, the importance of keeping the Lakeshore Boulevard traffic demand moving, so both eastbound and westbound lanes moving along Lakeshore. Road improvements, and I'll talk a bit more about these in detail, including improvements at the Jarvis Lakeshore Boulevard intersection, Cherry Lakeshore Boulevard intersection, and then maintaining the east-west lanes, as well as looking at all the various intersections in the larger study area and adjusting the timing of the traffic signals at over 80 locations, again, to keep traffic moving as much as it can. Sign detour roads, and we'll present to you some various detour plans throughout the construction period, and those detour roads will change. So signage is very important to inform drivers and trail users as to what are the detours at any point in time. And then the final point, you know, the expectation that with these mitigation measures in place, that there will be no adverse effects to the public transit system, so that there are other options available for people to move through the corridor. Next slide. So starting to get into some of the details regarding the traffic mitigation plan. On this slide, it's focused on the first is the reconstruction of the eastbound off-ramp at Jarvis for drivers to exit the Gardner. So with the removal of Logan ramps, the Jarvis off-ramp becomes the last off-ramp to exit the Gardner before accessing the DVP. And then the second point is the related to Lakeshore Boulevard. So throughout the construction period, keeping 2 eastbound lanes and 1 westbound lane open at all times. So again, to facilitate that flow of traffic through the corridor. So next slide. So as indicated earlier, Jarvis Street intersection and the Gardner eastbound off-ramp, certainly an important part of the traffic management plan. I think everyone or many people appreciate some of the complexity of this Jarvis Street intersection, and a number of changes are being implemented to accommodate the higher demand or higher flow of traffic that will now come through this intersection with the closure of the Logan ramps. So to facilitate that, the improvements included shifting the median. So on item 1 on the slide, so shifting that median south a little bit to allow for 2 lanes of eastbound through traffic. Item 2, maintaining that double left turn for drivers to turn to go north on Jarvis Street, and then having with the 2 through lanes, and then another through lane, so 3 through lanes for eastbound traffic, and then 4 and 5 are tied together. With 5 is the closure of the eastbound on-ramp that provided access to the overhead Gardner, but with the removal of that on-ramp or the closure of that on-ramp, it now eliminates that requirement for the split signal timing at that intersection that would have held up some of that eastbound traffic to allow drivers to cross over the intersection to access the ramp. So with the removal of that split signal timing, a greater volume of traffic can be processed through that intersection. And yeah, so those are the major improvements at this intersection. Next slide. So as well, we've heard of concern, or I've heard concerns from residents, stakeholders about traffic on local streets and concerns about infiltration of traffic onto local streets. So this is certainly something that we'll need to continue to monitor, including receiving feedback from residents and other stakeholders to determine whether or not there is greater infiltration occurring on some of the streets. The modeling work to date is not showing that, but nevertheless, there are other mitigations that may be possible that could be implemented to address any concerns that may develop over the course of the construction period. Some of these mitigations are shown here as examples, included making changes to existing one-way streets, implementing turning restrictions onto some streets for certain times of the day, and then adding dynamic speed warnings on some neighborhood streets if speeding is identified as an issue. But again, this is a long-term monitoring program that the City and Waterfront Toronto will continue to examine during the course of construction. Next slide. So now looking at detours and closures as they are proposed. So basically presenting the detour plans for both roads and cyclists and pedestrians. And there's a number of drawings here, and this information will also be available online so people can see what the various detours will be available, appreciating that these detours will change during the course of construction. So next slide. So it will be important certainly to communicate the detours. In developing, as I indicated earlier, in developing the management plan, there is certainly input received from the Construction Liaison Committee that includes residents and business representatives, as well as consultation that occurred with the users of the roadways and the cycling facilities. But during construction, there will be clear road detour signs so that drivers know where to go, information signs with details about how to learn more about the construction and the timing and the closures, traffic notices mailed or through digital means, project website information, and then finally, and certainly encouraging people to sign up to the email list so that information can be sent directly to individuals who have an interest in the project. Next slide. Okay, so first starting in September, so next month, extending into October during weekdays. Next slide. So here we're showing the most significant change here is closures of Commissioner and Don Roadway. And then the proposed route, so outlined in blue, shows how drivers would access DVP from the Portlands, which is a route that includes Cherry, Villiers, down Salter, then along Commissioners, up Carla, and then west along Lakeshore to access, so to make a right turn onto the Don Roadway. Next slide. So then during weekends, next slide. So during weekends, the weekends is the focused period for the removal of the Logan ramps that I explained earlier. So on this slide, you see that Lakeshore Boulevard in both directions, so extending from Carla over the Cherry, will be closed. And that closure is required for to allow the safe removal of those overhead ramps. Can have people underneath the area during the demolition of the ramp, so that requires the closure of Lakeshore Boulevard East through this section. So detours through the area on a weekend period. So similar route as I indicated earlier for the weekday for the Portlands, the use of Villiers, Salter, Commissioners, Carla, and then for that east-west movement, it would be to the north, so up Carla, Eastern, Broadview, and across Queen or across Eastern. And then to access the DVP, it would be the Queen Street on-ramp would be the main access point, or the Eastern on-ramp would also be available for northbound access to the DVP. Next slide. And then this slide is showing the detour for the east-west movement during the weekend. So again, from Lakeshore and then up Carla, along Eastern, over the DVP, and then down Parliament to access Lakeshore Boulevard. So again, a more northern route to go around the area of construction along Lakeshore Boulevard. Next slide. This is a bit of a zoom in on the area of focus where the main construction is happening on Lakeshore Boulevard. So the red showing the roads that are closed or fully closed, and then the orange showing roads that are intended for local traffic only. Other notable changes included along Moore Street of reversing the one-way direction to a southbound direction, and then maintaining a single lane of traffic along Lakeshore Boulevard between Morse and Booth. But again, the intention here is that for the Booth, Logan, Moore Streets, that is intended primarily for local traffic only and not for through movements, but keeping those roadways open for local people to use those roads and maintaining access through this area. Next slide, please. Another issue certainly associated with construction projects, major construction projects such as this, is the potential for noise. This slide highlights the red, so the area of demolition of the ramps, as well as the residential areas that are closest to the project and the distances. So the east, about 250 meters, and then to the west, northwest, about 500 meters. So these distances are certainly much greater than distances associated with more recent projects associated with the rehabilitation of the Gardner further to the west. So the expectation is that noise impacts should be reduced. Demolition is to be between daytime hours up to 11 p.m. There will be noise monitoring undertaken, as well as a program set up for residents to make contact should noise become a concern, become an issue, so that the project proponents can look at ways on whether or not some of that noise issues, should they emerge, be mitigated. But again, we're seeing fairly significant separation distances between the project area and the residential areas. Next slide, please. So then moving into, so now October to August 22, now that the Logan ramps are out of the way, construction on the Lakeshore Bridge and Lakeshore Boulevard East can advance. So next slide. So during this period, item 1 is the maintenance of road lanes along Lakeshore Boulevard, including 2 eastbound lanes and 1 westbound lane. And I guess the reason for that lane configuration was, or has come out of the construction modeling, or transportation modeling, and much heavier demand on the eastbound movement in the PM peak period, which is requiring those 2 lanes versus the maintenance of 1 lane in a westbound direction. So during this period, again, we see a very similar access out of the Portlands, as I showed earlier, coming along Villiers and Salter, Commissioners, Carla, and Lakeshore to access up into the DBP, and then maintaining that east-west movement along Lakeshore Boulevard during the construction period. And then item 2 just highlights the partial opening of the new Cherry Street alignment, which is just to the west of the existing Cherry Street alignment that would be expected to be open by May of 2022. Next slide. Okay, and then moving to, August 2022 to the December 2024. And again, appreciating that while these detours may seem to be a bit confusing, that this information will be available online, and there'll be much advanced notice to ensure people understand the various detour routes. So as of August 2022, Villiers Street would then need to be closed, again, associated with the Portlands Flood Protection Project. But with that closure, we have then a greater opening of the new Cherry Street, extending all the way up to Lakeshore Boulevard, so that new alignment opening up, and then the Commissioner Street opening up. So then the detour route out of the Portlands would then now extend up Cherry, along Commissioners, Carla, and then over to along the Lakeshore to access the DBP. So instead of Villiers, traffic's now being routed along Commissioners. Next slide. So in addition to the closures and detours associated with road traffic, similar plans are also required for the movement of cyclists and pedestrians through the area. So the next set of slides focus on those detours. So next slide, please. So starting September and extending to November. So again, associated with the removal of those overhead Logan ramps, and the initiation of the bridge reconstruction. So the key closures include, so item 1, the Lower Don Trail closed. Again, not specifically associated with this project, but being closed for improvements to the Lower Don Trail. 2, the cycle bridge over the Don River removed, associated with this particular project. And then 3, the closure of the multi-use trail along Lakeshore Boulevard. So again, that's required because of safety reasons during demolition and reconstruction. So with that removal, the detours through the area have some similarities to the detours associated with the road traffic. So for east-west, cyclists, for example, coming along Lakeshore Boulevard moving west would then go down Carla, along Commissioners, up Salter, Villiers, Cherry, and then continue along Lakeshore East. And then to the north, the use of Cherry Street and Mill Street, and then up Bayview, as well as the maintenance of the trail through the Keating Precinct area just to the north of Gardner, as shown in yellow. The next slide. So then, just to highlight some of the improvements associated with Carla and Commissioners associated with the main east-west detour. So I'm just going to focus in on Carla. Next slide. So with Carla, I'm sure many of you appreciate that we have an existing conditions that's not fully conducive for cycling, including only a 1.5 meter sidewalk, a 3.5 meter boulevard, but no separated cycling infrastructure. So the proposed upgrades to facilitate this detour include the construction of a 3.6 meter bidirectional multi-use trail that would be separated from road traffic with about a 1.4 meter grassed boulevard. And there's to be shared pathway markings along the trail, and as well as signage at intersections and driveways with respect to the trail. Next slide. And then similar, just focusing in on this section of Commissioners that's shown in yellow on this slide. Next slide. So we have an existing condition of a sidewalk on the south side, but only extends between Don Roadway and Logan, and no separated cycle infrastructure along Commissioners. So the upgrades would include first extending that sidewalk on the south side from Logan to Carla. And then secondly, constructing separated cycle lanes, both eastbound and westbound cycle lanes along Commissioners. Noting that Commissioners is to be a single vehicle lane in each direction, and that Salter, Carlisle, and Lakeshore Boulevard to be separated from parking and travel lanes with a concrete barrier, again, for more safety protection for cyclists. Next slide. So now showing detours from that November 21 period to May 22. So again, the ramps are out of the way, but construction of the bridge in Lakeshore Boulevard East is underway. The main detour route being primarily Carla, Commissioners, Salter, Villiers over the Cherry, and then to the north, on the north side. So number one, showing the closure of the Lower Don Trail, and that's to in tandem or to accommodate the initiation of the construction of the sediment debris management facility on that parcel line, requiring the closure of the trail system. So then a reliance on Cherry and Mill to avoid this section of closed trail. Next slide. We're just zooming in a little bit on the improvements near Cherry and Lakeshore to facilitate the detours. Next slide. So we have an existing condition of sidewalk on east and west side, single direction separated delineated cycle lane on east and west sides, but certainly constraints due to the existing rail bridge that Cherry passes under. So the upgrades to facilitate this include first intersection reconstruction, including at Lakeshore and New Cherry, as well as intersection reconstruction at Mill and Cherry to facilitate cycle infrastructure improvements, as well as certainly under the rail bridge of the installation of a visual separation barrier between the road lane and the cycle lane, so bollards would be installed to separate those lanes under the rail bridge. Next slide. Again, showing detour routes from May to August of 2022. Key change here is a partial opening of New Cherry, shown on number 1. Next slide. And then from August 22 to March 24, we have the New Cherry along the western edge there, fully open, so available as part of the detour. And then the transition of the east-west detour from Villiers down to Commissioners, similar to the detour for road traffic. And then the more northern detour as well, shown with Cherry and Mill Street. Next slide. Oh. So I think at this point, I pass it back to you, Mara, to talk about consultation that has occurred with the road and trail users.
Sure, thanks. And I think this is also a good moment for a slight pause to acknowledge, as Dawn did, that this is a lot of information that we're presenting all at once. And of course, the individual phases for the detours, both for cyclists and pedestrians and for drivers, are going to be rolled out as they change, and we'll walk people through it. There'll be more opportunities than just this one meeting to walk people through it, and to also flag concerns or comments as we move through the various phases of construction. We are also circulating versions of these maps in addition to this. I will also say that there are people on this call who have been members of our construction liaison committee. We've also had an opportunity to speak with some businesses and residents about this. And those people have had the opportunity to sit with this material. So we, again, do appreciate that. Sometimes it takes more than a couple of times through to get a sense of what's going to be happening. It's a complex project with a lot of moving parts. So the next slide is starting a little bit of a summary of the feedback that we have heard already from those businesses, residents, road and trail users that have had an opportunity to see these same detour maps and some of the same information that we're showing today. And just to feedback, as it may kind of help to understand what we've heard and what information we have applied to our traffic management plan for the construction period moving forward. We've heard questions about trucks. So there are commercial and industrial businesses that operate fleets of trucks that are coming north out of the Portlands, that are coming out of the area between Eastern Avenue and Lakeshore in this part of the city. And the question is, do we feel certain that the design accommodates? This is the long-term design. All trucks according to citywide standard. And yes, we've confirmed, of course, that truck turning radii, meaning how much room does a truck need at the corner to safely make that turn, that all of the types of trucks that move through these areas can be accommodated. Same thing during construction. The same studies have been done to make sure that the detour routes that we're proposing can safely accommodate all these different types of vehicles, so trucks and cyclists and pedestrians and personal vehicles as well. So the next thing that's been raised was accessing the DVP from Lakeshore Boulevard East, and some requests, in particular from businesses, for an additional dedicated left and right turns. And the obviously consolidated answer to that is that adding those dedicated turns would reduce obviously the flow of east-west traffic on Lakeshore to one lane. And would cause queues back onto the Lakeshore Bridge, which is a safety issue, and that's why that's not being seen as an option. The team, however, has identified opportunities to adjust signal timing at many intersections in the broader area that we showed on that map, including along Lakeshore, to try and keep traffic moving and keep all turning movements for all modes of traffic as smooth as we possibly can. Next slide. And a request for more east-west lanes on Lakeshore Boulevard East during construction. and to adjust our plans for those partial closures on Lakeshore. As Dawn was walking everyone through, there's a plan to keep 2 eastbound lanes open and 1 westbound. That's based, as he noted, on the extensive traffic study that was done that found that the majority of traffic on Lakeshore going eastbound, which is why those 2 eastbound lanes are staying open. So next slide. What we've heard from cyclists using all the trails through this area is that all routes should have physical separation. We definitely agree. And as Dawn walked you through, any of the temporary detour routes will have jersey barriers, which are higher than the lower concrete curbs that you might find in some of the more permanent facilities. So that's including along that extra stretch of Commissioners. And where we have multi-use trails, they will also be separated by either a curb or a planted buffer. There were concerns raised about lighting and road surfaces. The lighting was evaluated through the entire detour system, and there weren't any flags. And there are some spot repairs that are planned along the detour route. So, for example, on Carlaw, where we have some uneven surfaces, that will be addressed as the routes are installed. Also, some concerns raised about the fact that we have some intersections where you have a bi-directional trail, so cyclists on the east and west side of the street or on the north and south side of the street meeting up with a unidirectional trail where you've got the cyclists going east-west in the same place or north-south in the same side. All the intersections were designed, obviously in close collaboration with the City of Toronto, to make sure that these transitions are smooth and accommodate a high volume of cyclists. And there's an example here that I won't walk you through, but it's just one example of the many ways that those connections were thought through to make them as smooth as possible. So next slide. Hiller is flagging that he can't see the slides. I will let either Kate or Michaela try to address what's happening there with him. Safety continued as a theme. We had questions about intersections. So all those same questions we had about physical separation and safety along the routes were raised at intersections, of course, as well. There are some changes. Dawn alluded to rebuilding some of those intersections at Cherry and Lakeshore to make a more direct, especially that north-south route for cyclists. That will become much more direct and more protected for cyclists moving through the intersection. And the team also did analyze turning movements at intersections and made sure that, again, the geometry of those intersections accommodates both large trucks and other more sensitive users of those roads, so that we're avoiding conflict at those locations. And then there were questions about the selected routes, which we don't get into a lot of detail here, but what I will say is, obviously, this is a collective effort across teams, also working with the city, and the routes that are being recommended. There are other ways to travel, and of course, that's at the cyclist or the pedestrian's discretion. We've highlighted the ones that were deemed the safest and the most convenient, as in the most direct, but we will actually create versions of these trail detours in Google Maps, which would allow a cyclist to plan their trip based on preference. They can see what conditions they'd be riding through and make some decisions about whether they'd like to take a different route. Next slide, please. Now we're on to next steps. So what happens after this meeting and how will we communicate with you moving forward? So next slide, please. One thing I will say is this is obviously, as David mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation, well, the work that we're doing on Portland's flood protection is part of work that ongoing transformation in the broader Portland's area, which you can see highlighted in gray there. There are lots of other precincts and projects identified in the Eastern Waterfront. You can see them in the darker blue color there. And there's work moving forward on various timelines for all of that revitalization. There's lots of transit projects that need to be advanced through the area, including the Waterfront East Transit, the Ontario line, just to name two, and many other projects that are not even on this map that need to advance in the Eastern Waterfront. So it doesn't end with the river in 2024, although it's a very exciting milestone with the completion of Villiers Island, the new river, and some of these new roads and cycling facilities that we're going to be delivering as part of this work, as well as the rebuilt Lakeshore Boulevard between Don Roadway and Carlaw. But then there's work to be done, east of Don Roadway, west of Don Roadway on Lakeshore, as well as through all of these other projects. And that information, that's obviously beyond just Waterfront Toronto. That's City of Toronto, Metrolinx, and others working as project proponents on these various initiatives. So all that information has to roll out over the coming years. Next slide. So once construction starts, we are planning on having another public information center in September to check in on traffic impacts, noise impacts, and to provide those additional construction updates. At that point, we'll be providing updates just for the next coming quarter. So it won't be this full overview again. It will just be sort of moving forward. We'll give the types of updates that you saw David give for Portland's flood protection. In the meantime, we'll be posting regular updates at the construction page on the dedicated project website, portlandsto.ca. You've got the link there. And if you have questions or concerns about construction, there is a dedicated phone and email for this work, as well as an online form that you can submit comments or complaints through on our project website. So there's various ways to reach us, and we'll also be sending notices. I think that's the next slide, actually. Do you want to advance the slide? Oh, maybe not. Anyways, as I was saying, we'll be sending traffic notices, and we'll be contacting and updating everyone through the Waterfront Toronto newsletter or construction notices that you will have signed up for, which you can do through the website as well. And then finally, a couple of next steps and upcoming milestones in the Portland's flood protection piece. Don was noting on the maps there, on those detour maps, when New Cherry Street will open. So you can see here a rendering of what New Cherry Street will look like with the bridge beyond. And the next slide. Another really exciting piece of work that's starting soon is that river valley that you saw in the aerial video that David narrated over. We've got the river finishes in that first section. So finishes meaning the bottom of the river valley, including rocks, and soil will start to get placed soon. And then the next step after that horticultural soil is placed is actually to start planting. This is some of the plants that are already in the nursery that have been selected to go into the river valley, and they'll start to get established before water ever starts to move through the river valley, so that by the time water is moving through, these plants will have had time to establish and be mature enough to withstand the force of that water. The next slide. And of course, more bridges are coming. For those of you who've been following the project, you know that 2 bridges have already arrived. In the top right there, that's what the twin bridges on Cherry Street over the Keating Channel will look like. We've got 1 of the 2 already installed. And then you can see the Cherry South and Commissioners Bridges over in the other 2 renderings. We've got 1/2 of the Commissioners Bridge already arrived and installed, and we'll be expecting the second half of that bridge later this summer. And then the last slide, I will let everyone peruse at their leisure. A couple of resources if you're interested in learning more details about the work that's underway on Portland's flood protection.